Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why two people with the same mental health diagnosis can seem so different? That is the big question this study dives into. Imagine you and a friend both get diagnosed with, say, depression. You might feel overwhelmingly sad and have trouble sleeping, while your friend might feel numb, have no energy, and find it hard to focus. Why are you both labeled the same thing when your experiences are so different? This is called diagnostic heterogeneity. And it is a real problem for both doctors trying to treat you and researchers trying to understand these illnesses. This study wanted to figure out just how big this problem is for some common mental health conditions and, even more excitingly, see if there is a way to make these labels more useful. The researchers looked at 6 well-known internalizing disorders: specific phobia, social anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. They used 3 different methods to measure how much these diagnoses vary within themselves. Think of it like this. The first method, descriptive heterogeneity, asks how many different ways a person can meet the criteria for a diagnosis. Like, if a diagnosis needs 5 out of 9 symptoms, how many combinations are there? And importantly, how many of those combinations do we actually see in real people? Then they looked at person-focused heterogeneity. This asks if people with the same diagnosis actually have similar symptom patterns. So, if you took 2 people with the same diagnosis, how different are their symptom lists? The last method, construct-focused heterogeneity, looks at whether the symptoms within a diagnosis tend to behave similarly in other ways. For example, do they all have the same impact on your daily life, or do they all show up in the same way in biological tests? They basically check if the symptoms grouped together in a diagnosis actually have similar links to other important factors. To do this, they gathered data from over 14,000 people who reported having a good amount of mental health challenges. This is great because it means they weren't just looking at people who are already perfectly healthy. They were looking at people experiencing real difficulties. They asked these participants about a whole bunch of symptoms related to these 6 disorders, using a pretty detailed questionnaire. So, what did they find? It turns out, not all diagnoses are created equal when it comes to how varied they are. Specific phobia, surprisingly, was the least heterogeneous. This means that if someone has a specific phobia, their symptoms tend to be quite similar to others with the same diagnosis. Social anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, and generalized anxiety disorder were somewhere in the middle, with some aspects being more varied than others. But the big news is that major depressive disorder, MDD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, were shown to be highly heterogeneous across the board. This means that when you use the standard diagnosis like MDD or PTSD, you are lumping together a huge range of different experiences. The researchers found that this heterogeneity really undermines the usefulness of these labels. It is hard to know what a diagnosis means for a specific person if there are so many ways to meet the criteria and so many different symptom combinations. But here is the really exciting part. The researchers explored a different way to group symptoms called empirically derived phenotypes. These are groups of symptoms that naturally tend to go together based on how people actually report experiencing them, rather than just following the strict rules of the DSM. Think of them as smaller, more specific mini diagnoses that are created by looking at the data. They found that these empirically derived phenotypes, these data-driven groupings, actually made the diagnoses much less heterogeneous. It is like they were able to break down the big, messy category of MDD into smaller, more cohesive groups of symptoms. For example, within MDD, they might find a group of symptoms related to sleep problems and fatigue, and another group related to sadness and loss of interest. When they looked at these smaller groups, the people within them had much more similar experiences. This is a really big deal. It suggests that instead of relying on broad diagnostic labels that can mean so many different things, we could potentially use these empirically derived phenotypes to create more precise and informative ways to understand and treat mental health conditions. They found that the narrowest clusters of symptoms, the most specific groupings, were the least heterogeneous of all. The study authors highlight that this is a practical path forward. If researchers or clinicians have data on individual symptoms, they can essentially rescore that data to create these more refined empirically derived phenotypes. This could make research more focused and treatment planning more personalized. Now, it is important to acknowledge the study's limitations. The sample wasn't perfectly representative of everyone. They were mostly from Australia and the USA and had a higher rate of people seeking mental health treatment. This means that the exact symptom patterns might look a little different in other cultures or in the general population. Also, they use self-report questionnaires, which are great for getting a lot of data, but they're not quite the same as a clinical interview with a professional. And the 12-month recall period might not perfectly align with how official diagnoses are made. So, what does this all mean for us? This research is a really important step towards making mental health diagnosis more accurate and helpful. It shows that the big categories we currently use, like MDD and PTSD, are really broad and can hide a lot of individual variation. By looking at how symptoms actually group together in real people, we can create more precise tools. This could lead to better research that focuses on specific symptom clusters and, in turn, more tailored treatments that address the unique experiences of each individual. It is like moving from a general map of a country to a detailed street map of a specific neighborhood. The more precise the map, the better you can navigate. The idea that we can rescore existing symptom data to create these more informative phenotypes is particularly exciting because it means we don't necessarily need to start from scratch. We can build on the data we already have to create better classifications. This could really speed up our progress in understanding and treating mental health conditions. What are your thoughts on diagnostic labels and how we categorize mental health challenges? Do you think these smaller, data-driven groupings could be more helpful? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science insights, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.